Margaret Hayes was 19 when she fell in love with Jacob Wells. He was a ranch hand working for her father, strong and quiet, with a gentleness about him that made her feel safe in a world that often felt too rough and unforgiving. They met in the barn one summer evening when she was helping with the horses. He smiled at her, and something in her chest caught fire. For 6 months they loved each other in secret, stolen moments behind the stables, whispered promises under the cottonwood trees. He told her he was saving money to buy his own land, told her that as soon as he had enough, he would ask her father for her hand, told her to wait for him. And she did. She waited and loved him and believed in the future he painted for her. But then Margaret's father found out. Not about the love or the promises, but about something else, something that would change everything. Margaret was pregnant. Her father was a hard man, a proud man, and the shame of an unwed daughter carrying a child was more than he could bear. He did not ask who the father was. He did not want to know. He only wanted the problem fixed before anyone else found out. Within a week, he had arranged a marriage. Richard Hayes, a widower, 20 years older than Margaret, who owned land to the north and needed a wife to help raise his 2 young sons. It was a practical arrangement, respectable, quick. Margaret tried to tell her father about Jacob, tried to explain that there was already a man she loved, a man who would marry her if given the chance. But her father would not hear it. Jacob was a hired hand with no land and no prospects. Richard Hayes was established, secure, and most importantly, willing to marry her immediately without asking questions. Margaret begged, she pleaded. She told her father she'd rather die than marry a man she did not love, but her father's decision was final. She would marry Richard Hayes in 3 days, or she would be cast out with nothing and no one. The night before the wedding, Margaret slipped away to find Jacob. She found him in the bunkhouse, and when she told him what was happening, she saw his heart break right there in front of her. He asked her to run away with him. They could leave that night, head west, start over somewhere no one knew him. But Margaret was terrified, terrified of her father's wrath, terrified of being alone and penniless with a baby, terrified of the unknown stretching out before them with no guarantees. She wanted to say yes. Every fiber of her being screamed to say yes. But fear is a powerful thing, and fear makes people betray the ones they love most. Margaret told Jacob she could not go with him. She told him it was too risky, too uncertain. She told him she had to think about the baby, about security, about survival. And then she said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She told him she was not sure if the baby was even his. It was a lie. A coward's lie, meant to make him stop fighting for her, meant to make her let him go. And it worked. Jacob stared at her like she'd driven a knife into his chest. He did not argue, did not beg. He just turned away from her, and she saw his shoulders shake once before he steadied himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. He told her he hoped she would be happy, and then he walked away into the darkness. Margaret married Richard Hayes the next day. She stood at the altar in a borrowed dress and made vows to a man she barely knew. And when the baby was born 7 months later, everyone whispered and counted on their fingers, but Richard never questioned it. He raised the girl as his own, gave her his name, loved her the best way he knew how. Margaret tried to be a good wife. She cooked and cleaned and cared for Richard's sons. She raised her daughter with as much affection as she could give while carrying the weight of her betrayal. She never saw Jacob again. He left the territory right after the wedding and never came back. The years passed. Richard died when Margaret was 43, leaving her the house and enough money to live on. Her daughter grew up, married, had children of her own. Margaret became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother. She built a life that looked full from the outside, but inside she carried Jacob with her every single day. She thought about him when she looked at her daughter's blue eyes. She thought about him on summer evenings when the air smelled like the barn where they first met. She thought about him every time she saw an old man with white hair and wondered if that was what Jacob looked like now, if he was even still alive. She thought about him, and she hated herself for the choice she made, for the lies she told, for the fear that made her choose safety over love. And now, at the end of her life, lying in a bed with death creeping closer by the hour, Margaret finally had the chance to tell the truth. Someone from the old town had written to Jacob, told him Margaret was dying, and somehow, across all those years and miles, he had come.
Jacob stood in that doorway for a long time after Margaret's confession. Her daughter sat frozen beside the bed, staring at the old woman who was suddenly a stranger. The truth hung in the air like smoke, choking them all. Finally, Jacob spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He told Margaret he had known, not about the baby, but about the lie. He had known she was afraid, known she was protecting herself the only way she knew how, and he had walked away not because he stopped loving her, but because he loved her enough to let her go. Margaret sobbed then, a broken sound that hurt to hear. She reached toward him, but her strength was gone. Jacob did not come closer. He just stood there, holding his hat, looking at the woman he had loved and lost and never stopped loving, even when he tried. He told her he had never married, never had children of his own. He had spent his life working other people's ranches, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Because roots require hope, and hope had died the night Margaret told him that lie. But then his eyes shifted to Margaret's daughter, sitting there with tears streaming down her face, and something in his expression softened. He studied her features, the shape of her nose, the color of her eyes, the way she held her shoulders, and slowly, like dawn breaking over the prairie, he smiled. He told Margaret's daughter his name, told her he did not expect anything from her, did not want to disrupt her life or make claims on her heart, but if she ever wanted to know about the man whose blood ran in her veins, he would be around for a while, at least long enough to answer questions. Margaret watched this exchange through fading vision, her breath coming harder now. She reached for Jacob's hand one more time, and this time he came to her. He sat on the edge of the bed and held her frail hand in his rough, calloused one. She whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for not hating her. Thank you for forgiving her, even though she did not deserve it." Jacob shook his head slowly. He told her forgiveness was not his to give or withhold. They had both lost something precious because of choices made in fear and pride. But maybe, in the strange way life works, they had also gained something. A daughter, a granddaughter, a great-granddaughter, a bloodline that carried both of them forward into the future. Margaret died 3 hours later. Jacob sat beside her the entire time, holding her hand while her daughter held the other. And when she finally took her last breath, there was peace on her face. Not the peace of a conscience cleared, but the peace of truth finally spoken. Jacob stayed in town for 2 weeks. He met his grandchildren, told them stories about their grandmother when she was young and full of life, told them about a love that was real, even if it ended badly. And when he finally left, he did not leave as a stranger. He left as family. Some truths come too late to change the past, but they can still reshape the future. Margaret had waited 53 years to confess, and in those 53 years, she had built a life on a foundation of lies and fear. But in her final moments, she had given her daughter and Jacob something real, something honest, and maybe that was worth the cost of carrying the secret for so long. Or maybe not. Maybe some choices are just tragic, and we tell ourselves there is meaning in the suffering because the alternative is too painful to bear. But this much is true. Love does not die just because we betray it. It lingers, haunting us, reminding us of what we were too afraid to fight for. And in the end, the only redemption we can hope for is the courage to finally speak the truth, even if we have to use our last breath to do it. If this tale touched your heart, and don't ride off just yet, there are more stories waiting beneath the western sun, tales of love, betrayal, and lessons learned the hard way. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story reminds us that love still rides, even across the roughest frontier. Because out here, under the wide open sky, the truth always finds a way home.